I first noticed something was different because the water sounded wrong. Not louder, just interrupted. A low, uneven echo carried across the lake as I stood on my back deck before sunrise, coffee cooling in my hands. The surface still held that pale early light, the kind that makes everything feel unfinished. But the sound didn't belong to morning birds or the soft movement of water against the reeds. I waited, listened again. Down the shoreline, beyond the bend where my property ended, something metallic scraped once, then stopped. Silence returned, but it didn't feel settled. It felt temporary. I've lived by this lake for years, not as a retreat, as a routine. Mornings like this, quiet enough to hear my own breathing, were why I bought the land in the first place. The lake wasn't large, but it had a way of slowing time. No docks, no shared amenities. Just water, trees, and the long habit of stillness. That morning I walked closer to the shoreline. Across the water, on the far side near the clustered homes managed by the Homeowners Association, orange stakes had appeared. Thin ribbons fluttered between them, catching the light in small, restless motions. They hadn't been there yesterday, or the day before. I stood there longer than I meant to, letting the scene register. The stakes followed the curve of the lake. Not randomly, intentionally, as if someone had traced the edge with a careful hand. Later that afternoon, an email arrived. The subject line was neutral enough: community enhancement update. No greeting, no explanation of urgency. Just a clean block of text announcing the beginning of a lakeside improvement initiative. According to the message, the project would enhance shared access, visual cohesion, and recreational value for the surrounding neighborhood. There was no mention of my name, or my property, or the fact that the lake itself was privately owned, bordered by land parcels that had never been designated for communal use. The language was polished, procedural. It read less like a proposal and more like a conclusion already reached. I reread it twice. Still, I assumed there had been a mistake, an oversight. These things happen when decisions move faster than conversations. I told myself it would be cleared up with a quick call, maybe a meeting. A pause. That evening, as the sun lowered and the lake smoothed itself into reflection again, I noticed something else. Temporary markers pushed closer to the water line. Closer than before, close enough to matter. I didn't do anything right away. I just stood there, watching the light thin across the surface, trying to understand when quiet places stop being asked and start being assumed, and wondering who exactly had decided this was already settled. The next morning, the lake woke before I did. I stepped outside just after dawn and heard voices, quiet, measured, professional. Not loud enough to feel invasive, but present in a way that shifted the air. Across the water, two figures stood near the marked shoreline, clipboards tucked under their arms. They spoke in short bursts, occasionally gesturing toward the lake as if outlining something invisible. I watched from my side, unnoticed. One of them bent down and pressed a stake deeper into the soil. The sound carried farther than it should have. A dull thud, then another. By mid-morning, a second email arrived. This one included a name. Her message was polite, composed. She introduced herself as the HOA's project liaison and thanked residents for their continued trust in community-led improvements. The wording implied an ongoing conversation, one I didn't remember being part of. She explained that the project would include a modest structure near the water, not a building exactly, a shared lakeside facility, something that blended with the natural surroundings. She emphasized harmony, aesthetic continuity, responsible stewardship. I read the email slowly, then again. There was no map attached, no boundary clarification, no request for consent, just a timeline. I replied with a short message, neutral, careful. I explained that I owned the lake and the surrounding shoreline on my side, and that I hadn't been consulted. I asked for clarification about the scope of the project and whether it would affect private land. Her response came within the hour. She thanked me for reaching out and assured me that all actions were within established community parameters. She suggested a brief site walk later that week to address any concerns. The tone was calm, almost reassuring, but it didn't answer the question I'd actually asked. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter myself. The stakes were closer now, arranged in a loose arc that suggested intention rather than exploration. Some sat just feet from the water's edge. One had been placed where I usually set a chair in the evenings. I knelt and touched the soil around it, still soft from the morning dew. This wasn't aggressive. That's what unsettled me most. No warnings. No raised voices, just progress, steady, unchallenged, already underway. As the light shifted and the lake took on its afternoon glare, I realized something else. The people working across the water never looked toward my side. Not once. They moved as if the space had already been agreed upon, as if silence had been interpreted as permission. I took photos, not dramatically, just enough to remember where things were before they changed again. When I returned to the house, her follow-up message was waiting. She had scheduled the site walk for Friday morning, no question mark. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, aware that something small, but important, was beginning to solidify without me, and that once something takes shape by the water, it's rarely as temporary as promised. Friday arrived without ceremony, which somehow made it heavier. The lake looked unchanged that morning. Mist hovered low over the surface, and the water carried the soft gray of an unfinished sky. If I hadn't known what to look for, I might have believed nothing was happening at all. She arrived precisely on time. A compact sedan rolled to a stop near the shared access path on the far side of the lake. She stepped out with a folder tucked neatly under one arm, dressed in neutral tones that matched the language of her emails. Calm, professional, unhurried. I met her at the shoreline where the property line curved inward, a place I'd always considered transitional rather than defended. She smiled politely, the kind of smile meant to keep things smooth. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said. Her voice carried easily over the water, practiced but not cold. We walked together along the edge, the stakes forming a quiet third presence between us. She explained the project in measured terms, how the structure would be modest, how materials had been selected to blend into the environment, how residents had expressed interest in a shared lakeside space. I listened, nodded where it felt appropriate. When I mentioned ownership, she paused, just briefly. Then she opened her folder and showed me a diagram, not detailed but confident in its lines. The project footprint stopped just short of where she indicated the boundary to be. "This is all within our reviewed area," she said gently. "We're being careful." I pointed to a stake closer to the water, one I knew marked my land. "That one isn't," I said. She studied it, then the ground, then the lake. Her expression didn't change much, but something in her posture adjusted, as if recalibrating. "There may have been some preliminary placement," she said. "Nothing finalized." The word preliminary lingered. I asked why I hadn't been consulted before anything was placed at all. She didn't bristle, didn't apologize either. She explained that the HOA operated under long-standing assumptions about shared benefit, and that early stages often moved faster than individual outreach. "It's not meant to exclude," she said. "It's meant to streamline." We stood there, water lapping softly at the shore. A bird cut across the lake and disappeared into the trees. I realized then that she wasn't here to debate ownership. She was here to keep momentum intact. Before we parted, she assured me nothing permanent would happen without further review, that my concerns would be taken into consideration. She said it kindly, as though the phrase itself carried weight. After she left, I remained by the water. The stakes were still there. The ribbons still moved in the breeze, and despite the conversation, nothing had been removed, corrected, or paused. As the sun climbed higher, the lake resumed its familiar rhythm. But it felt thinner somehow, less protected. I understood then that this wasn't about a structure. It was about whether quiet objections could survive inside systems designed to move forward without waiting, and whether standing still would be enough. The first piece of lumber appeared on a Tuesday. It wasn't dramatic. Just a stack laid neatly near the access path, pale wood still carrying the scent of fresh cut. I noticed it while the lake was mid-morning calm, the water bright enough to reflect the sky without glare. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have mistaken it for supplies left temporarily, something waiting for a decision that hadn't quite arrived yet. But the decision had arrived, quietly. I stood at the shoreline and counted 6 boards, uniform length, aligned with care. Nearby, more stakes had been added, their ribbons trimmed shorter this time, less visible from a distance. That afternoon, I sent another message. I asked plainly now whether construction had begun. I attached photos, dated, labeled, factual. I kept my tone even, not confrontational, just present. Her reply came later than before. She acknowledged the materials and explained they were part of preparatory staging, not construction. She reiterated that no permanent installation would occur without final confirmation. The language was careful, as if shaped to reassure without committing. I walked the shoreline again before sunset. Someone had cleared a narrow strip of brush near the water, not wide enough to notice from afar, just enough to make movement easier. The lake reflected the clearing like a thin scar, visible only if you knew where to look. That night I pulled out the property documents, old surveys, maps with faded ink. I spread them across the kitchen table and traced the lines slowly, my finger following curves I'd memorized over years of walking them. The boundaries were clear, precise, undramatic. I wasn't wrong. The next morning I placed small markers of my own along the edge, discreet, respectful, unmistakable, not to escalate, just to clarify. I photographed them too, then waited. When she called that afternoon, her voice was still calm, but there was a new firmness beneath it. She said the HOA had concerns about unilateral actions. That coordinated communication was important, that these projects relied on trust. I listened, then said something I hadn't yet said aloud. Trust usually starts before the stakes go in. There was a pause, not long, just long enough to register. She suggested another meeting, a review, a chance to align expectations. After the call, I sat by the lake until the light drained from the water. The surface darkened, holding reflections longer than it should have. The boards across the way were still there, unchanged by conversation. It struck me then how easy it was for small actions to gather weight simply by remaining in place. How presence, once established, begins to argue for itself. And I wondered how much longer the lake would be asked to adjust before anyone else did. By the time the second meeting was scheduled, the lake had already adapted. Not visibly, at least not to someone passing through, but in the way routines quietly shift when something unsettles them. I found myself waking earlier, listening longer. The stillness I used to trust now felt provisional, as if it could be interrupted at any moment without warning. The meeting took place outdoors, near the access path where the lumber waited. She arrived with a second folder this time, thicker, its edges worn as if it had already passed through several hands. We stood facing the water, the structure's outline now easier to imagine than ignore. She spoke first. She explained that the project had broad support within the association, that it had been discussed in planning sessions and informal surveys. that the lake was viewed, carefully phrased, as a shared visual and experiential asset, even if ownership lines said otherwise. I asked her when that distinction stopped being central. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she talked about stewardship, about how spaces like this benefited from organized care, about how unmanaged quiet could be mistaken for underuse. I let that sit between us. I told her about mornings like the one when I first noticed the stakes, about how the lake functioned because it wasn't optimized, because no one had tried to improve it into something else. I said it calmly, without accusation. She listened, really listened, I think, but when I finished, she returned to procedure, to how momentum worked, to how difficult it was to pause something once resources had been allocated and expectations set. People are already imagining it, she said. That matters. I looked at the water, at the way the surface carried both our reflections without favoring either. So is consent, I said. That was when she mentioned the word resort, not officially, she clarified, but as a concept others had used. A lakeside destination. Modest, tasteful, a point of pride. The word felt heavy in the air, out of place against the quiet. She assured me again that nothing irreversible had happened, that adjustments could be made, that boundaries would be respected moving forward. But as we spoke, two workers arrived and began unloading additional materials. No power tools, no noise, just presence. After she left, I stayed. I took more photos, marked dates. Not because I planned to escalate, but because memory alone felt insufficient now. Too soft, too easily overridden by official timelines. As dusk settled, the lake smoothed itself once more, reflecting the half-built intention along its edge. I realized then that this wasn't about stopping something outright. It was about whether acknowledging a person required more effort than assuming their silence, and whether I was willing to keep standing here long enough to make that acknowledgement unavoidable. The lake changed its mood before anything else did. The water turned restless in the mornings, catching the wind more easily than it used to. Or maybe I was the one who had become restless, noticing every small ripple as a sign of something larger pressing in. Either way, the calm I once relied on now felt negotiated, like a courtesy rather than a constant. Construction didn't begin all at once. It never does. Instead, there were arrivals. A truck one day, a trailer the next. Each time they stayed just long enough to leave something behind, tools neatly stacked, materials covered with tarps, a temporary sign staked into the ground describing the project as a community lakeside pavilion. Pavilion sounded lighter than resort, intentional, softened. I emailed again, asking why activity was increasing when boundaries were still unresolved. Her reply acknowledged my concern and explained that halting progress entirely would be disruptive to contractors already scheduled. She emphasized that nothing crossed my property line, that everything was being monitored. I walked the shoreline with a measuring tape, not aggressively, quietly. I marked distances, noted angles, photographed the results. One support post had been placed exactly where the line curved inward, technically not on my land, but close enough to feel deliberate, close enough to feel like a test. That afternoon, she stopped by unannounced. She stood with me at the water's edge, watching sunlight scatter across the surface. She said she wanted to maintain transparency, that she understood how these changes could feel abrupt. Her tone was sincere, but her words stayed careful, arranged like stones meant to prevent slipping rather than invite conversation. I asked her if the project could pause, just briefly, until everything was clarified. She shook her head gently, not no, just not now. There's a process, she said. Stopping creates complications. I wondered aloud when listening had become the complication. She didn't answer that. As the day faded, the workers packed up and left behind the quietest outline of what was coming. Stakes connected by string, footprints pressed into damp soil, a future sketched lightly but persistently onto the present. That night I dreamed of the lake as it once was, not untouched but unclaimed. In the dream, the water reflected nothing at all. No houses, no plans, just sky. When I woke, the sound of an engine crossed the water. Another delivery. I stood at the window longer than necessary, realizing that momentum had a sound now, and that it was growing easier for others to hear it than the person who had always been there first. The lake didn't protest. It never would. The question was whether I still could, without raising my voice, without becoming something I wasn't, and whether restraint would be mistaken for agreement if I waited any longer. The first structure took shape slowly enough to feel theoretical. Posts went in one by one, pale against the darker soil. They weren't tall yet, just enough to suggest intent. I noticed them while the lake held its late morning stillness, the kind that usually invites reflection rather than calculation. That day I found myself measuring shadows instead. I didn't approach right away. Instead, I sat near the water with a notebook and wrote down what I saw, times, movements, distances. Not as evidence for anyone else, just for myself. I needed to understand the rhythm of what was happening, the way quiet projects grow confident simply by continuing. When she arrived later that afternoon, she didn't mention the new posts at first. We spoke about weather, about how the season was shifting. The conversation felt almost normal, which made the gap between us more noticeable. Eventually, I asked how many structures were planned. She hesitated, then said one, possibly two. It depended on usage patterns. Patterns formed by whom? I asked. She said by the community, by observed interest, by projections. I looked out at the lake again. The water reflected the posts clearly now, their pale lines interrupting the familiar curve of the shore. I told her something I hadn't articulated before, that the lake's value wasn't in what it could host, but in what it didn't demand. That adding purpose to a place designed around absence changed more than its appearance. She acknowledged that perspective. I could tell she meant it, but then she returned to scale, to how small the footprint was, to how the lake would still look the same to most people. That sentence stayed with me, most people. After she left, I walked the boundary again. One post stood close enough that I could reach it without stepping off my land. I rested my hand against the wood. It was smooth, newly treated. Temporary if you believed the language surrounding it. I imagined it years from now, weathered, unquestioned, folded into the idea that it had always belonged there. That evening I received a printed notice in my mailbox. Formal, brief. It summarized the project's status and reiterated that all development remained compliant with community guidelines. There was a contact number at the bottom, not hers, someone higher up. I didn't call. Instead, I stood by the lake until the light softened and the reflections blurred. The structure's outline faded into shadow, but I knew where it was now. That knowledge didn't disappear with the light. It occurred to me then that visibility wasn't the same as acknowledgement, and that sometimes the most effective changes happen when no one feels the need to announce them loudly. I wasn't angry, not yet. But I was running out of ways to be quietly present without being quietly replaced. The lake held onto fog longer that week. It lingered well past sunrise, blurring the far shore until the new posts appeared only as faint interruptions, suggestions rather than statements. I stood there one morning and realized how easily that could become permanent. How something once obvious could fade into accepted background simply by being left alone long enough. Work continued in short bursts. No steady noise. No full days of activity, just enough movement to prevent any real pause. The structure's frame began to suggest shelter now, a shape that implied use. Someone had placed a bench nearby, temporary, I assumed. But it faced the water in a way that felt decided. I sat on my side of the lake and watched a couple walk past it later that afternoon. They slowed, looked. One of them pointed. They didn't cross the line, but they didn't seem unsure either. That evening, I sent one more message. Not a complaint, not a demand, just a request for a written acknowledgement of the boundary and a clear statement of where the project would stop. I said it would help me feel grounded again in what had always been clear. Her response came the next day. She agreed to document the boundary. She thanked me for my patience. She reiterated that the association valued cooperation and wanted to avoid misunderstandings. The tone was softer than before, but the timing of the message, after the bench, after the frame, made it feel like a summary rather than a decision point. I printed it, added it to the folder on my kitchen table. Later that week, a small sign appeared near the structure. Nothing bold, just a plaque describing the space as a shared lakeside feature designed to enhance access and appreciation. There was no mention of ownership, no map, just intention. I realized then how language could function like water, flowing around obstacles, reshaping understanding without ever colliding directly with fact. When she stopped by again, I asked her if the sign would be revised. She said it hadn't been discussed. I asked if it could be. She nodded slowly. I can bring it up. Bring it up, not decide, not change. Just raise it into a system already moving. That night, the lake reflected the new structure more clearly than I expected. The frame caught the moonlight in sharp lines, casting shapes across the water that hadn't existed before. They weren't ugly. That almost made it harder. I stood there longer than usual, thinking about how easily something could be both well-intended and misplaced. How effort didn't guarantee alignment. The lake didn't reject the reflection. It never would. But as I watched the ripples soften the edges of what had been added, I wondered how many more quiet adjustments I was expected to make before my presence was fully absorbed into the background, and whether being patient had begun to work against me. The document arrived by email on a Sunday morning. No explanation in the body. Just an attachment labeled Boundary Clarification Draft. The lake was still half asleep when I opened it, the water pale and unmoving, as if waiting to see what would be decided elsewhere. The document was clean, technical. It showed lines and measurements that mostly matched what I already knew. Mostly, the project footprint had been adjusted, on paper, to sit just outside my property. The language emphasized respect, cooperation, and mutual benefit. But the map itself told a quieter story. The margin between my land and the structure was now so narrow it felt symbolic rather than functional. I replied, thanking her for sending it. I asked one question. What happens if the structure needs maintenance that requires stepping onto my land? The response didn't come until Monday afternoon. She said those situations would be handled case by case, with communication. She assured me the HOA had no intention of encroaching. The phrasing was careful again, focused on intention rather than outcome. That afternoon, I watched as someone repainted the boundary markers. Brighter this time, more visible. The line was clearer now, but it also felt closer, defined in a way that left no room for habit or interpretation. The structure had gained a roof by then, a simple one, angled to follow the slope of the land. It cast a longer shadow across the water in the evenings, and I found myself tracking its movement without meaning to. When she stopped by later that week, I showed her the printed document, the photos, the measurements. Not to accuse. Just to demonstrate attention. She acknowledged everything. She agreed the margin was tight. She said adjustments might still be possible, though more difficult now that the build had progressed. Difficult, I repeated. She nodded. But not impossible. We stood there quietly for a moment. The lake filled the space between us, reflecting both the structure and the trees behind it without distinction. I asked her something then that surprised even me. If this were your land, I said, would this feel settled? She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was lower. I think, she said carefully, I would want clarity sooner than this. The admission didn't change anything immediately. The structure remained, the schedule held, but something shifted in how she spoke after that, less certainty, more pause. That evening I noticed the lake was quieter than it had been in days. No engines, no voices. Just water and light and the long reflection of something newly permanent. For the first time in weeks, I felt less like I was being moved around. Not because the project had stopped, but because someone had finally paused long enough to stand where I was standing and noticed how narrow the line had become. The pause didn't announce itself. There was no email declaring a review period, no notice taped to a post, just a stretch of days where nothing arrived at the lake. No trucks, no voices, no incremental additions disguised as preparation. The structure stood as it was, roofed, framed, unfinished, present but no longer advancing. I noticed the stillness first in the mornings. The lake returned to its older habits, mist lifting slowly, water smoothing itself without interruption. I realized how much noise had been created not by machines, but by anticipation. Waiting had been louder than construction. Midweek, she called instead of writing. She said the association had agreed to reassess the project's final scope, not dismantle it, not relocate it entirely. Just reconsider how it interacted with the shoreline, with me. The concern, she said, choosing her words carefully, is that we moved faster than our understanding. I didn't respond right away. I watched a ripple travel from one end of the lake to the other, uninterrupted, and thought about how rare that had become. She explained that the documentation I'd provided, photos, measurements, timelines, had clarified something internal discussions hadn't. Not ownership exactly, presence. The fact that someone was actively paying attention rather than simply reacting. I asked what reassessment meant in practical terms. She said the structure might remain unused for now. That signage would be removed. That access would be limited until a clearer agreement existed. None of it was framed as concession. It was framed as recalibration. When I went down to the water that evening, the bench was gone, not moved. Removed, the absence felt larger than the object ever had. The shoreline looked open again, unfinished in a way that felt honest. The structure still cast its reflection, but without invitation. Over the next few days, small things shifted. The sign disappeared. The boundary markers were adjusted back just slightly, but enough to breathe. No one said much about it. No announcements were made. The lake absorbed the changes quietly. She stopped by one last time that week. We didn't walk the perimeter, we just stood near the water and watched the light move. I don't think we meant to take something, she said, but I can see how we did. I nodded. It felt sufficient. Nothing had been reversed overnight. The structure still existed. The HOA still held authority nearby, but the pace had changed. The certainty had softened. As she left, I realized that what mattered most wasn't the pause itself, but that it had happened at all. That momentum, once interrupted, had acknowledged something it hadn't before. That the lake wasn't empty space waiting to be improved. It was already held. The lake didn't celebrate the pause, it simply continued. Days passed without new activity, and the structure settled into the landscape in a different way. Not as a promise, not as a threat, but as something unfinished that had lost its urgency. The water learned its outline, softening the reflection until it blended more easily with the trees behind it. I stopped documenting every detail, not because I trusted the situation entirely, but because the tension that had kept me alert began to loosen. I slept later. I stopped listening for engines. Mornings returned to being about light rather than expectation. A revised document arrived the following week. This one was shorter, clearer. It acknowledged the private ownership of the lake explicitly and outlined limitations on use, access, and maintenance. It framed the structure as dormant unless future agreements were reached. The language wasn't apologetic, but it was careful in a way it hadn't been before. I signed it, not as approval of what had happened, but as recognition of where things now stood. When I sent it back, she replied with a simple thank you. No reassurance, no justification, just acknowledgement. The workers returned once more, not to build but to stabilize. They secured loose materials, reinforced what was already there, and left. When they drove away, the sound faded quickly, as if the lake had learned how to absorb it. I walked the shoreline that evening and noticed how little evidence remained of the weeks of activity. A few compressed patches of soil, slightly altered grass, things that would disappear with time. The structure remained, of course, but it felt different now, less like a declaration, more like a question that had been set down gently instead of pushed forward. I thought about how easily this could have gone another way, how silence might have been taken as agreement, how politeness could have been mistaken for absence. Nothing dramatic had stopped the project. No raised voices, no final ruling, just attention. Sustained, quiet attention. She stopped by once more before winter edged closer. We talked briefly about weather patterns, about how the lake changed color as the season shifted. Then she left, and I knew that would be the last conversation we'd have about the structure for a while. As dusk settled, the water reflected the sky in long, steady bands of color. Familiar again. The lake hadn't been reclaimed. It had simply been recognized. And sometimes that recognition is enough to change how decisions are made, without needing to erase what already exists. From a distance, nothing about the lake appeared resolved. That was the first thing I noticed as winter settled in and the mornings grew paler. The water still moved slowly. The surface still caught the light in familiar ways, breaking it into soft fragments that drifted toward the shore and disappeared. Anyone passing by would have seen the same quiet lake they always had, and that was the point. The structure remained where it was, unfinished and restrained. No lights were added, no paths widened. It existed now without invitation, without signage, without the quiet insistence that had once surrounded it. It had become part of the background rather than the future. I returned to my old routines without ceremony. Coffee on the deck before sunrise, a chair near the water in the evenings, long pauses where nothing needed to happen. The lake accepted all of it without comment. It always had. What changed wasn't visible unless you knew where to look. The boundary markers stayed where they'd been reset. Clear, respected. The association didn't revisit the project. No new proposals arrived dressed in softer language. Decisions that once moved without pause now arrived slower, framed as questions rather than conclusions. Nothing was reversed overnight. No grand apology arrived. No announcement marked the moment things shifted. But the silence around the lake felt different, earned, not assumed. I understood then that what had been labeled a community project was no longer automatic. It required attention. It required presence. It required someone to be there long enough that absence could no longer be implied. The lake itself hadn't needed defending. It never asked for that. What it needed was acknowledgement, of ownership, of history, of the fact that quiet places are not empty just because they don't demand anything. Sometimes authority moves simply because no one stands in its way, and sometimes standing still is enough to be noticed. As the season turned, the structure weathered quietly. The water adjusted as it always does. The reflections softened. The edges blurred. Time did its work without urgency. To anyone else, the lake looked unchanged. But I knew where the changes were, not just along the shoreline, but in how decisions were made nearby, in how plans slowed, in how questions were asked before assumptions took shape. Some places don't need to be protected with force. They just need someone willing to stand there long enough to be seen. And sometimes that's enough.